In the first decade of the 9th century, the Tibetan Empire was at the height of its power. Under the leadership of the late Emperor Tritsuk Detsen, the empire had grown to become a vast multi-ethnic state that rivaled the great nations of Central and East Asia. To those living under his reign, the empire would have seemed unassailable and destined for immortality. None could have known, however, that within one generation, the entire Tibetan Empire would collapse, never to rise again. Why did the Tibetan Empire fall so suddenly, and how did the ensuing Dark Age transform Tibet's religious and political future? To answer those questions, scholars turn to post-imperial histories and the story of the last great Tibetan emperor, whose controversial reign and untimely death would plunge the empire into civil war. In the year 815, following a period of civil unrest, a new Tibetan emperor was enthroned. His name was Tritsuk Detsen, but he's better known today as Ralpachen, or the long-haired emperor. The eldest of two brothers, Ralpachen had inherited an empire that was rapidly changing and faced profound existential threats from foreign powers, as well as factions within the imperial court itself. In the West, under the leadership of previous rulers, the Tibetan Empire had extended as far as the ancient walled city of Samarkand, but was now hard-pressed by the Islamic Abbasid Caliphate, who pushed Tibetan forces back to the defensible mountain passes of Kashgar and Wakhan. To the north, a new alliance of semi-nomadic Turkic-speaking peoples had confederated to form the vast Uyghur Khaganate, which was openly hostile to the empire and posed a significant threat to the trade routes that lined its northern frontier. Meanwhile, to the east, the empire's oldest rival, the Chinese Tang dynasty, had recovered from the catastrophic Anlushan rebellion and now sought to recapture the lucrative Tibetan-controlled city-states that lined the northern Silk Road. As wars raged on distant battlefields, in central Tibet, a radical cultural transformation was underway. Buddhism, which had been embraced as a state religion under the reign of Ralpachen's grandfather, continued to flourish with ever-increasing royal patronage. For a generation, the education of rulers had been entrusted to Buddhist clergy, while freshly built monasteries provided a new class of highly trained administrators and scribes who would quickly become essential to the governance of the empire. Tibetan histories suggest that Ralpachen was himself a devout Buddhist who went far beyond his predecessor's support of the religion, investing enormous sums of money to promote Buddhist institutions. Despite his efforts, however, for the time being, Tibetan Buddhism remained little more than a court religion, and behind closed doors was deeply unpopular with factions in the aristocracy, who were quietly organizing in armed opposition to the new religion. These growing tensions came to a head only a few short years into Ralpachen's reign. The uneasy peace that held across the empire's northern frontier was shattered in the year 816 when the Uyghur Khaganate petitioned the Tang court for a military alliance, sealed by the marriage of a Chinese princess to the Uyghur Khan. The Tang quickly accepted, which was interpreted by Ralpachen's ministers, no doubt correctly, as an effort to shift the balance of power in Asia and wage a coordinated campaign against the Tibetan Empire from the north and east. The young Tibetan emperor, with the support of his ministers, moved quickly to respond to the threat of a Tang-Uyghur alliance. Taking a defensive posture in the west, the Tibetans mustered new armies in the east and, bolstered by the veteran cavalry of the Abbasid campaigns, declared war on both the Uyghur Khaganate and the Tang dynasty. The ensuing conflict was devastating. Historians know very little about the individual engagements fought during Ralpachen's reign, but it is clear that, despite being outnumbered and fighting on two fronts, the Tibetans used the initiative of their campaign to fight both empires to a standstill. And in the year 821, with their respective militaries depleted, representatives from the Tibetan and Tang empires came together to sign a lasting peace. Under the terms of the treaty, which were carved in stone, a border between Greater Tibet and Greater China was established, and the delegations agreed to a non-aggression pact, which was sealed with both oaths and animal sacrifice. The Sino-Tibetan Treaty would have been seen by many as a great boon, a chance to recover after 5 years of brutal conflict. The sudden arrival of peace, however, had unforeseen repercussions for the stability of the empire. Like other ancient and medieval empires, the Tibetan Empire was reliant on conquest to support its military campaigns. Seizing new territories provided the state with natural resources, manpower, and wealth, which was quickly consumed, used to furnish the lavish imperial court with luxuries, as well as finance the imperial administration and its armies. With its forces now badly depleted, and with the new peace limiting the empire's ability to raid and expand, the treasury began to drain at an alarming rate. Meanwhile, in central Tibet, Ralpachen continued to expand his patronage of Buddhist institutions. New monasteries and temples were built at great expense, and recently translated texts on philosophy and Buddhist virtues were commissioned and circulated throughout the empire. In later Tibetan histories, Ralpachen's unwavering support for the new religion, even in the face of economic crisis, is widely celebrated, earning him the title of the last great Chogyal, or Dharma King. Over the course of the following decade, however, the emperor's lavish spending became increasingly controversial and divided the court along religious lines. Ralpachen was supported by his Buddhist ministers and recently converted aristocratic leaders who shared an allegiance with the monasteries of central Tibet, which had grown to become influential centers of politics and culture. Aligned against them, Ralpachen's younger brother, now a towering man known as Langdarma, had become the leader of the clannish opposition movement within the court itself. Opposed to the emperor's patronage of Buddhism, and in a bid to bring the empire back to solvency, Langdarma and his allies planned in secret to depose the Buddhist emperor. And in the year 838, after gaining the support of the Wa and Chogdro clans, they were ready to begin. To ensure the success of their plan, Langdarma's allies first spread a rumor that the emperor's closest minister and friend, the influential monk Pelgyi Dorje, was the secret lover of one of Ralpachen's queens. The rumor quickly took root, and in a fit of rage, the emperor banished the Buddhist minister, alienating himself from many of his closest monastic allies. The conspirators sent assassins to kill the disgraced minister, and the queen took her own life shortly afterwards. During the chaos that followed, as the emperor took in the early morning sun, Langdarma killed his own brother and seized the throne for himself. His reign would be short and plagued with conflict. In Tibetan histories, Langdarma's reign is often characterized as one in which Buddhism was widely persecuted throughout the empire. Recent scholarship suggests, however, that despite gaining the support of anti-Buddhist factions, this perceived persecution took the form of a new imperial policy, under which the court would no longer finance Buddhist institutions. This sudden and unexpected withdrawal of patronage would have led to a crisis in which monasteries and temples were forced to close or were dramatically reduced in size, leaving many monks destitute without financial support or shelter. These policies drew the ire of Buddhists throughout central Tibet, who placed the blame for the sudden and dramatic decline of monastic institutions squarely on the shoulders of the new fratricidal emperor. And in the year 842, only 4 years into his reign, the emperor was assassinated by a monk named Lhalung Pelgyi Dorje. The assassination is widely mythologized in post-imperial histories. According to one account, as Langdarma walked in the city streets of Lhasa, the monk Pelgyi Dorje approached him and performed a ritual dance. the motions of which disguised the assassin's true intentions. Without warning, the monk drew a bow and arrow from underneath his black cloak and fired a single shot, fatally wounding the apostate king. As the story goes, Pelgyi Dorje fled the city mounted on a white horse, which had been painted black with soot. Plunging into the Kichu River to evade the emperor's soldiers, the black dye washed away, and he emerged from the waters as a white rider. Thus disguising himself and evading capture, the monk assassin fled to eastern Tibet, where he lived out his days in peace. The assassination of Langdarma sent shockwaves through an empire that was already fragile and internally divided. At the time of his death, the emperor had an infant son by a junior queen who was quietly placed on the throne. In the following weeks, however, a second queen came forward with a young child of her own, claiming that he, being slightly older, was the legitimate heir. A conflict ensued. Both claimants to the throne were backed by powerful clans, which began to mobilize and arm themselves. With clan rivalries and great wealth at stake, the situation quickly escalated into a full-blown war of secession. As fighting raged in central Tibet, in the absence of a strong imperial administration, the empire's colonies began to break away, seeking independence or falling under the control of local warlords who established their own petty kingdoms. In time, one son took control of the central Tibetan region of U, while the other laid claim to an eastern Tibetan stronghold. These became their own minor kingdoms, neither with the power to assert itself over the lucrative regions to the north, nor the political and military ability to forge new alliances and expand their territories. In the power vacuum that followed, the armies of the Tang dynasty swept across the Gansu corridor, capturing the oasis city of Dunhuang in 848 and seizing the last major trade route still controlled by imperial factions. The once mighty Tibetan Empire had all but ceased to exist, crumbling gradually through economic and religious strife, political instability, and finally, civil war. At its height, the Tibetan Empire was a unique civilization, which for 2.5 centuries had united a vast territory under a single banner with the Tibetan language as a lingua franca. The empire may have been gone, but in its place there remained a shared language, similar conceptions of kingship, and the long-lasting memory of imperial culture and its religion. As the institutions of the empire faded away, a patchwork of petty kingdoms emerged across the plateau. In the absence of patronage, monasteries and temples were largely abandoned, falling into disrepair. Traditional Tibetan accounts often describe this period as the time of fragmentation, a dark age in which Buddhism was suppressed and the knowledge and laws of the empire were all but forgotten. Modern scholarship has shown, however, that rather than a dark age, the centuries following the collapse of the imperial state were, in fact, a vibrant period that sowed the seeds of a cultural and religious revival that we now call. Thank you for watching. I'm Alex, the writer and director of the series, and I want to thank our backers on Indiegogo who helped finance this episode, and also our supporters on Patreon, all of these wonderful people right here. If you're interested in learning more about Tibetan history or the Tibetan Empire more specifically, you'll find all of our references in the video description, but you'll also find expanded reading lists, commentary, and annotated bibliographies for each episode on our Patreon, as well as interviews with specialists in Tibetan history and culture, like this interview with Professor Louis Donny at the University of Bonn, which covers the middle and late periods of the empire and provides much more depth than we were capable of covering in this episode. None of our Tibet-related content on Patreon is paywalled. It's all free to watch and free to use. But if you like what we're doing on the channel, please consider becoming one of our Patreon supporters to help us make more content like this in the future. But whatever you do, wherever you are, I hope you never stop learning.